Hocam başlatalım mı?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, just a second. Yes.
Hi, Tanya. Meanwhile, I can see Tanya is here. I'm so happy to see the Barry and Jasmine again. Hello. Good
Hello,
afternoon.
welcome.
Hello,
Istanbul.
everyone.
Okay, good afternoon, dear professors. My name is Ibrahim. I'm the research assistant at the university. Thank you for joining us and for contributing your valuable insights to this panel. Today's sessions will be moderated by Dr. Tuğba Gülal, and we are grateful for her guidance and through this discussion. And thank you all once again for being here. I wish everyone a fruitful session, and I'm now glad to leave the floor to our moderator, Professor Tuğba Gülal.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for this nice introduction. And yes, welcome everyone. And I'm so honored to moderate the panel titled Counter Models of Optimization and Communication, Ecological Peace and Arts. And this panel brings very unique professors and practitioners who alternatively contribute to the nature of art from different thought spectrums and perspectives. And I think it's very important for us today to understand how actually a digitized world functions and how actually the way the art can be helpful for our understanding for today's world. And it's such a privilege to moderate this panel, and I deeply appreciate the speakers who didn't refuse my invitation for it and made this event happen. Before proceeding with inspiring papers, which I am thrilled to hear more about, let me shortly introduce professors and their papers titles. The first speaker is Assistant Professor Barry Stoker from Boğaziçi University, Turkey. Barry Stoker teaches philosophy at Boğaziçi University. He has doctorate from the University of Sussex in the UK. He is the author of Derrida on Deconstruction, Kierkegaard on Politics, and Philosophy of the Novel. Earlier this year, his book chapter Foucault's Baroque appeared in Ornamental Thinking, Metaphysics and Aesthetics of Decoration. He is currently working on a manuscript for a proposed monograph on liberty on Foucault. And second speaker is Assistant Professor Jen Schmidt from University of Arkansas, USA. Jen Schmidt is a multimedia artist and educator based on Fayetteville, Arkansas, and assistant professor in the School of Art at the University of Arkansas. Her work spans living sculpture systems, drawing and installation, engaging ecological process and decomposition, soil making, and renewal. Schmidt is a co-founder of the Prairie Pedagogy Research Group, has a long-standing collaboration with Quechua filmmakers in Ecuador, and frequently works with mathematicians, technologists, and scientists. Her work has been exhibited most recently at the Poincaré Institute Museum in Paris and the Toshiyan Studio Gallery in Jingjiang, China. With additional exhibitions she's still working on in different parts of the world, such as in Boston, in Kansas City, Madrid, Quito, and Cuenca. And third speaker is Assistant Professor Jasmine Ploss from Texas State University, USA. Jasmine Ploss is an assistant professor of instruction in studio art at Texas State University. She researches and teaches painting, drawing, and interdisciplinary practice focusing on history, theory, and philosophy of art. Her personal art practice focuses on the history of painting, asking how it functions in society, past and present. This has led her to create traditional paintings on canvas and panel as well as performances. Painting-based installations and spectacles that bring the painting process into consumer and social space. Her paper's title is Self-Imagining and Identity Construction in an Infocratic Society. And first speaker is Assistant Professor Barry Stoker, and his presentation title is Art, Utopia, and Heterotopia in Foucault. Yes, the floor is yours, professors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tuba. How long do I have?
Actually, each speaker has 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I'll start with how Foucault deals with space in terms of there being three kinds of space he explores in 1966 and 1967. So, of course, in 1967, there's a paper on other spaces, that paper he presents to an architectural association. But there's also something else on space in the order of things, the book he published in 1966. So the order of things begins with a discussion, a preface, which he brings up Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer. He brings up a passage from Borges on a Chinese encyclopedia. In fact, that passage is embedded in something which I guess doesn't, it's not important now. But there's a passage within a text by Borges about the imaginary Chinese encyclopedia, which anyone who's at all familiar with Foucault has probably come across that. But very briefly, it's ways in which things are categorized, which don't seem to make much sense from the general scientific, rationalistic point of view. But they're possible categorizations. So Foucault says this made an enormous impact on him, made him burst into laughter, and it's the inspiration of his book. There might be an element of self-mythologization there, but he is signaling something important there, and that includes how he defines this example of Borges' writing that probably apply to a very large part of what Borges writes, or what people call Borgesian. So that's atopia. So a non-place, which is not something that Foucault defines at length. I suppose order of things provides a very long contextual definition. But the atopia is a without place, which challenges the categories with which we organize space. So the order of things concentrates on spaces of knowledge, going through a kind of medieval and Renaissance episteme to a classical, that is early modern episteme, to a modern episteme. In that, what he says about the early modern episteme, the classical episteme, is to put it in terms of simultaneous spatiality, which he sees as undermined by 19th century episteme, which is organized around history, around time. Though what he says in other spaces about utopia and heterotopia, he suggests, it doesn't expand on this fully, he suggests kind of return of an interest in simultaneous space in what he refers to as contemporary epoch without defining it. So anyway, it seems, I think, for Foucault that a kind of relationship between spatial organization and temporal organization is rather important. Of course, discussing atopia, utopia, heterotopia is one way of expanding on what spatial organization is. I think trying to avoid being a structuralist, a term he rejected but was often applied to him. So he's trying to avoid the reductiveness of structuralism, and while having a full analysis of what simultaneity is, simultaneity being what we have when we consider space. So the heterotopia and utopia side of this, the utopia is the imaginary space. The heterotopia can be imaginary. Anyway, the utopia is in some ways, it'd be very difficult to say what it is without it overlapping with the Borgesian atopia. But obviously, utopia is an imaginary ideal. The heterotopia could have ideal aspects, but it could be imaginary or real. The point being, it provides some kind of other space in comparison with a normative space. Of course, he combines that discussion with a discussion of the exclusion of deviance. So one way heterotopia is organized is around communities which, exist outside the norms. So that could be something rather joyful, like a carnival, though perhaps in Foucault we should be very careful about assigning a kind of moral quality to his analysis. At least the carnival sounds like something that could be positive. But it also refers to what is excluded as deviant. So that would match with his discussion of the incarceration of the insane in the early modern period. Also his discussion of prisons as something that becomes a normal means of punishment in the 19th century. So though Foucault defines heterotopia as something that's of particular interest in his time, right in the 1960s, obviously it's something that he sees as always part of thinking, always part of the epistemological fields being used, or the power relations of the time. So that the prison is an example of a heterotopia, which becomes normalized in the 19th century. But Foucault sees heterotopia as particularly of his time. He mentions in this context the cemetery. Again, this is a process we take back to the 19th century. So Foucault says that the more that society becomes secular, even atheistic, the more that the cemetery becomes sacralized. It's no longer part of the normal life of a city. It's put on the outskirts. Bodies are given individual spaces. The space itself is other than the city. So that can be taken as sacred. The entry to a cemetery becomes something different in the modern cemetery than in the older form of the cemetery. Now, we can match that with what Foucault has to say in various places about life, and then about biopolitics. So, of course, biopolitics is something that he starts referring to in the 1970s, I suppose mid to late 1970s. But we can see things which head in that direction before then. So, the order of things, he refers to life as becoming an organizing principle, really with the collapse of the classical episteme. So that would be the beginning of the modern episteme. He looks at that with reference, obviously, particularly to biology. Though it would be anachronistic from Foucault's point of view to refer to biology in the classical period, because there is no sense of life in general. There is just categorization. There's a breakdown of living beings into anatomies and into anatomies. Well, they're anatomized into parts, but also in the sense of the way we construct trees of life, or we construct tables in which things are put in. Tree of life, again, is projecting back a later term. So life becomes an organizing principle for Foucault in the natural history of the late 18th century, the breakdown of the classical episteme. And that allows the emergence of evolutionary theory. So we could say they're the foundations of biology as we know it now. Not that all biology as we know it now is present in Darwin, but for Foucault, there being biology literally means there's a science of life. And life as an organizing principle really becomes fully developed in Darwinian evolutionary theory, but has precedents in earlier French thinkers about natural history. You start looking at organisms and life as a whole. So actually, we can take that back a bit earlier to the birth of the clinic. Which is really an account of the birth of modern medicine. And the clinic we should really understand as the modern hospital. So, of course, hôpital particular meaning is in French, so that's why it's birth of the clinic. So that rather follows on from his account of the origin of the insane asylum, of course, that being a place where the mad are excluded, defined as deviant. Now, this is, you could say, something to do with organizing life, and then that is particularly clear with the emergence of modern medicine, which Foucault puts in a very political context. He really thinks that currents of thought about medicine, which are already present in the monarchy in 18th century France, achieved some kind of fulfillment during the French Revolution, partly because projects emerge of some kind of national health scheme, along with the more strict the developments of science strictly defined. And where medical science heads to have what we now call medical science is the idea of the unity of the living organism. What Foucault emphasizes there is we can only understand that through death. So the medical thinkers who Foucault says are the origin of modern medicine are giving some importance to death, because it's only death which gives real unity to the body. Because death is not the failure of any particular organ. And a concern with death in medical terms or any other terms takes us beyond an account of discussion of particular organs, which is what Foucault claims medicine had been about before, a focus on organs. And Foucault links that in Birth of the Clinic, he links that medical concern with death as the organizing principle. It's also an organizing principle of life. It coincides with the emergence of modern biology as the first science that's really organized around life, the understanding of the unity of life. But that's linked with death. Of course, that comes up in the order of things because the move from the classical episteme to the modern episteme is really linked with the kind of appreciation of death in Hegel, in related poetry of Hölderlin and later 19th century philosophy and poetry, particularly Nietzsche. So the focus on life and death is very closely linked. They can't be separated in Foucault's analysis. And then that coincides with biopolitics. Since biopolitics is something that emerges from the early modern state. The early modern state is focused on sovereignty without much concern for the kind of public policy issues with regard as central to the state now. But the sovereignty of the prince becomes more an issue of the survival of the state itself, and that becomes partly an issue of maintaining population. The strong state needs a population to pay taxes and fight wars. And that's really where we get the development towards biopolitics, because the state then becomes defined not by its capacity to end life. It's obviously sovereignty could be symbolized by execution. The execution of the criminal, particularly treasonous criminal, but any criminal, it's the power to take life, which is defined sovereignty. But then Foucault says with biopolitics, sovereignty becomes the power to extend life, which of course we can see as benign. But Foucault points to how it can be extremely non-benign. So at the extreme, Nazi death camps are in fact based on a principle of life, because they're based on a principle of racial hygiene. And the whole the mass deaths of Jews in mass murder of Jews in death camps is medicalized. The gas, the Zyklon gas, is kept in medical facilities. So there's an ideology and even a series of practices which treat genocide as the support of life, as the hygiene of the healthier parts of the human race. So biopolitics has some, you'd think, obviously benign aspects, which Foucault seems to be referring to when he talks about the health projects of the French Revolution. But it has a rather horrifying aspect, which is tied to spatialization, to a space in which we exclude deviance. That being a necessary part of heterotopia, and heterotopia Foucault sees, I think he's saying, is dominant in the 20th century, implicitly, I suppose, as compared to the emphasis on life in the 19th century. But then these two things converge: life as hygiene, racial hygiene, destruction, what deviates from that becomes linked with the tendency towards heterotopia, the death camp being an extreme kind of heterotopic place, a sort of horrifying expression of one of the tendencies of the state in general, the counter space to the state in its relatively benign intentions. Anyway, I think these considerations lead Foucault in the late 70s to be concerned with the state restraining itself. Sorry, I think I have to finish it in a minute. I'm not really watching time, but do I have to finish in a minute, Tuba?
You have 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving to another side of heterotopia, In the essay on other spaces, Foucault mentions a kind of older form of heterotopia. So the way that Foucault periodizes things, he jumps around quite a lot. And something which is dominant in one period can still leave important traces in another period. So in the other spaces essays, among heterotopia, he says, well, we got some very old heterotopia before the 20th century way of thinking about this. And that includes Persian gardens, which of course are actually very linked to the idea of paradise, and carpets. So Persian carpets, presumably carpets from Turkey and Afghanistan. So I wouldn't be able to comment on myself, but I think Foucault assumes that there's something about the aesthetics of a carpet which links to the ideal of the garden. Obviously, the garden of the ruler or a very privileged people, which combines different elements and also claims to be paradisical. It's something isolated. The heterotopia for Foucault has to be partly defined by its being not completely accessible. There's some way in which we can't access it easily. And that the access could require a form of purification. So that could be very sacred, sacred form of purification when entering a religious space, but it could be to do with hygiene, like entering a sauna. The sauna is a kind of heterotopia from Foucault's point of view, which, given the role of the sauna in the culture of some countries, is, I think, quite appropriate. But it's purification, whether we define it in terms of health or in terms of religion. So anyway, the Persian garden is somewhere it's not so easy to enter. We get that in a modern garden. The garden is part of the space which is not public, at least if we're talking about gardens attached to homes. And of course, there are public gardens, but that in itself refers back to a history when the garden is a more privileged, restricted space. So that carries on in the modern world, in that the heterotopia could provide a kind of alternative, which is critical or better, or it's ideal in some way. So if we're thinking about the issues of biopolitics, well, the garden is also a zoo, or a zoological garden. Foucault emphasizes that phrase. So the zoological garden really starts as a kind of collection of curiosities. A kind of Renaissance interest in collection of curiosities is something Foucault emphasizes in the order of things. So the zoo itself starts off as a kind of ideal space, possibly not for the animals concerned, though, a collection of just a conjunction, addition of things which don't seem to belong together, which fascinate apparently the Renaissance mind and have some appeal to very much older interests of rulers. So that would really provide a basis for thinking about, one basis for thinking about ecology in Foucault, that we can have many spaces. Of course, the zoological garden, as originally conceived, is probably not something we'd advocate from a benefit, from regard of animal welfare. And of course, there's always an element in Foucault of power. There's always some kind of instrumentalization, which is possible. But heterotopia is a place where we could experiment and vary forms of living, forms of life. I think Foucault does want to restrict the state. He becomes rather interested in that in the late 70s when he's writing about neoliberalism. The idea of a state restricting itself, of governmentality restricting itself, becomes important for Foucault. So I think that must link to a kind of heterotopia, a kind of ecology in the broader sense, where in fact there are many spaces which are not all entirely accessible, but which allow experimentations of living, ways of evading complete instrumentalization by the state. And that we can see in the more broader ecological terms, in terms of nature or biology, that it needs to contain niches, it needs to be multiple, it needs to be varied. So I think there's something like that we can take as a kind of Foucauldian ethic of modern living, or something that we can refer to in politics. I guess I've run out of time now. Okay.
Perfect. It's just really, there are many questions crossing my mind. Probably for our listeners, that's the same. But we will have time for that during our panel discussion part after that all speakers have made their speech. Thank you so much. Now, I will go to the second speaker as Assistant Professor Jen Schmidt from University of Arkansas, USA. And her speech title is Threshold Ecologies at the Age of Optimization. Yes, Jen, hello. The floor is yours. Thank you. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that presentation, Dr. Stalker. Let me see how to share this presentation, share my screen. So I'm going to go to Presenter View. Let's see. I'm going to... Can I share my screen? Let's see.
Yes, I guess so. You can share it.
Share. Sharing is not turned on. I can request sharing for this meeting. So.
It's your co-host now. I think you can share it.
Okay, excellent. There we are.
Great.
Thank you so much. Okay, hello and thank you. We are living in a time of overlapping crises, social, political, ecological, and institutional. And in many ways we frame reality are through extraction, speed, and control. Optimization is designed to narrow the outcomes, sorting lives into categories. So where do we look for alternatives, and at what scale does change happen? And threshold ecologies ask what becomes possible when living systems organize a studio practice and inquiry, how might working with worms, roots, soils, plants, and collective structures affect how change happens in the worlds we share? Under the influence of Arturo Escobar, Tim Ingold, Donna Haraway, and others, this has become a practice-based research project where making is a way of thinking, and thinking is accountable to the living systems that sustain us. In a moment when digital infrastructures shape much of life through prediction, efficiency, and measurable outcome, this project unfolds slowly and locally through interrelationships, attention, and shared processes, with change beginning at smaller microbial and relational scales. And we're looking at the compost from the worm bins under the microscope here. This begins underground in the rhizosphere, that world around roots where fungi, worms, microbes, water, and minerals create wealth through constant exchange. In Designs for the Pluriverse, anthropologist Arturo Escobar describes the post-dualist ontological turn, a shift from isolated individuals towards worlds understood through relations. Channeling indigenous cosmologies from around the world, he says things and beings are their relations. They do not exist prior to them. I didn't want to make work about this idea. I wanted to practice it. Tim Ingold's writing on making describes form arriving through correspondence, going along with materials, tools, forces, histories, and environments, rather than imposing order from outside. The rhizosphere is one place where that process is already active. In Kansas City, Missouri's Crossroads Arts District, planting a single urban street tree, the American hornbeam, involved an entire civic network, urban foresters, business associations, city officials, residents, nonprofits, and planners, even the Goethe Institute's Kansas City pop-up gallery. For that moment, I created Hornbeam Hub, Roots, Nodes, and Rhizospheres, a sculpture, a tree planting, and a community meeting that brought all these groups together. At first, I thought of the street tree as a metaphor for civic life. But in practice, I discovered that sustaining an urban canopy depends on complex, interdependent networks that are ecological, political, financial, and social. And artists can play an important role here, working with and highlighting these networks in ways that energize, showing the often hidden connections that allow a single tree or a whole canopy to thrive. At the same time, I was working with Quechua filmmakers in Ecuador through Minga, a practice of collective labor for communal benefit that is both a worldview and a method. With the Asociación de Productores Audiovisuales Quechua, or APAC, we developed Minga Audiovisual, co-creating films through Ranti Ranti, shared work and reciprocity, where story, process, and territory are all held collectively. Together with students, we use Minga Audiovisual, applying traditional Minga to media making. Escobar writes about the pluriverse, a world within which many worlds fit, a term popularized by the Zapatistas through their land struggles in Chiapas, Mexico. That concept supports this work, including Minga Audiovisual, as an experiment in how multiple worlds and ways of knowing can work together without being collapsed into one. Baden-Olford's distinction between crossing a river by bridge or crossing by raft offers one more image. A bridge is a fixed, engineered path and always the same. A raft is built together at the point of crossing and responds to currents. Minga Audiovisual functions more like a raft, a responsive place to people and its histories. In the studio, these questions shifted scale when I began working with red wiggler composting worms. At first, this was a practical response to kitchen scraps, but over time, feeding scraps, watching decomposition, and seeing waste turn into soil became a daily routine that set the studio rhythm. It changed how I think about work. What began as a metaphor, healthy soil as nature's collaborative community, became a regular practice. Donna Haraway's term symbiosis, making with, is useful here. She describes symbiotic systems as complex, responsive, and shared, and links them to what she calls responsibility. Working with worms, plants, and soils offers one concrete situation for this kind of making with. So now the studio functions more like a commons, where authorship shifts from a single maker to a distributive form across bodies, materials, and conditions. The daily practice with worms led me toward another form, a porcelain tureen. I grew up with one in my childhood home, ornate, carefully kept, and rarely used. It was close to daily life and yet remained separate from it. So historically, tureens carried that same tension, central to dining, both ornamental and functional, yet often dismissed in art history as minor or merely decorative. If a tureen becomes a living system, what kind of daily life could move through it? In the worm tureens, porcelain vessels contain soil, worms, moisture, scraps, and wheatgrass. They speak the domestic language of the tureen while operating as a living sculpture. Inside, worms transform scraps into soil, and wheatgrass grows from the lids. In exhibition, the wheatgrass is juiced and shared, and the pulp returns to the worms. They complete an externalized metabolism, and everything unfolds in shared view. The familiar container becomes a small architectural system, linking tableware, metabolism, and shared practice. This metabolism, a digestive process brought into shared space at human scale. In a culture often driven by extraction and acceleration, the work is structured around circulation, return, and continuity. Last summer, I worked with master potters in Jingdezhen, China, connecting these forms with much longer material lineages. Millennia of ceramic work shaped by clay, water, firing, and labor. The tureens bring together form, ecological process, collaborative making, and the material histories of porcelain. Here you can see the worms and the soil inside the vessel. Writer Linda Hogan asks, can we love what will swallow us when we are gone? On the table, they look familiar. Handles, feet, crown-like lids, but they also read as landscapes, stacked forms rising like columns and crowned with green, placing the ornamental as one more element in a living system of soil, plant, worm, and human. The tureens provide many thresholds, encouraging interrelationships to support our passages from one state to another. Here, Hogan's question touches on utility, life, death, and decoration. The worm tureens make this cycle tangible, where a domestic object houses decomposition and renewal. When the wheatgrass is juiced and shared, the work goes beyond objects as people enter the cycle through taste, conversation, and participation. The post-dualist ontological turn appears here as a sequence of small revolutions, small acts repeated over time that gradually change how we understand and practice relationships. These systems cannot be optimized without collapsing the relationships that sustain them. This video is a little over a minute and in length and was taken during a wheatgrass juicing event in Jingdezhen, China that corresponded with the exhibition Threshold Ecologies, Worm Tureens as Living Sculptural Systems. I'll turn up my volume, but it's okay if the sound does not come across. Working with worms also influences my drawing practice. Large graphite drawings render worms at human scale. Thousands of marks slowly build a vermicular vernacular, a patient and persistent search for the line language of worms. This drawing is built from repeated marks and by returning to the work over the span of about 18 months. Here's a closer view. But what is the line language of worms? Here is another response. Here the worms trail wheatgrass juice across the paper. These drawings record movement, agility, sensibilities to each other and the environment. Here, mark making becomes a shared process. The question of who is making the image shifts, and authorship spreads out across this small system. Here, the worm trails are laser etched on Arkansas sandstone. In these future fossils, how might traces of worm movement be read millions of years from now? And what will remain of our gestures? And how will our small moments be legible far into the future? In these works, authorship is never solitary. Mark making extends across time and beyond me, involving processes out of my control. Near my home is a remnant tall grass prairie. Its roots extend far below ground, holding more life underground than above. The University of Arkansas Prairie Pedagogy Research Group approaches this ecosystem as a partner in learning, a studio without walls. Here, creativity is relational, emerging through connection with materials, place, and one another, as well as the broader community of life. This extends my practice-based methodology into land-based contexts, where learning emerges through sustained engagement with ecological systems. We are native and non-native scientists, artists, and sustainability practitioners with members belonging to Caddo, Quapaw, Osage, Cherokee, Lakota, and Shawnee nations. And together we are exploring new ways of teaching and creating, grounded in these relationships to land and to one another. The root graphic points towards that below ground life and the institutional work following from it. It invites the question of how ecological and cultural relations shape collaborations in and beyond the university. So we are living in a time of overlapping crises, and many of the systems framing reality still rely on separation, extraction, speed, and control. The works I've described practice another direction, questioning how change will happen and at what scale. Throughout this work, my thinking about change has shifted. I used to think of transformation as something singular and dramatic. an event, a rupture, a revolution by any means. What this work has taught me instead is that some of the most radical change happens at the microbial level, in compost, in roots, in the slow conversion of scraps into soil, and in the repeated acts that make new relationships possible. Institutions are also living arrangements of relations. Can artists both critique them and instruct them through practice toward forms of participation that are less extractive, more collaborative, and more accountable to the worlds they inhabit? Artists and designers can help make these conditions visible and can help model them. What these projects ask across studio, classroom, exhibition, and community is what becomes possible when we understand ourselves as a part of rather than in contrast to. That shift is modest in scale, but profound in consequence. It changes how we might approach a classroom, a meeting, a collaboration, a neighborhood, a panel discussion, or a decision about the future. So the question I want to leave with is aesthetic, civic, and practical. What changes when we partner with hidden ecological and cultural networks? Threshold Ecologies approaches the question through making. We have built a studio infrastructure that allows us to practice these relationships while producing the forms that make them visible. In this sense, the work is less about opposing optimization from the outside than about becoming part of other ways of living, making, and continuing together. Thank you.
Dear Jen, thank you so much. It's fascinating. I remember while we were in Barcelona, I was first time heard why this worms, and I was surrounded by how actually the idea is inspiring. And I remember it was great to see how actually worms are creating alternative counter spaces. Thank you. And I think we will have more time for panel discussion part. Thank you so much. Now I will go to our third speaker, Assistant Professor Jasmine Plotz from Texas State University, USA. And her paper title is Self-Imaging and Identity Construction in an Infocratic Society. Now the floor is yours, Jasmine. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the previous presenters and to Toba for organizing the panel. I'm going to quickly share my screen and get started. Let's see. Share settings. Okay. Perfect. Are y'all able to see the screen?
Yes, we can see that. Yes.
Okay, and it's just the presentation. Okay, good. All right. Most of us have thousands of images of ourselves, but none of those images on their own really feels like us. This is part of why we constantly accumulate, curate, present, and prune our self-image collections. I'm going to argue why this is the case, how we use self-images to construct identity in an infocratic society, and how artists are using and could use the proliferation of self-images to explore identity in an increasingly datafied system oriented toward optimization for distant platforms and corporations rather than for interpersonal understanding. Oh. So we each have thousands of images of ourselves. And like I said, no single image feels adequate to capture who we really are. This is how we see ourselves kind of through our phone on a daily basis. We see ourselves using, not using single images, but by using collections. And these collections are constantly being added to, taken away from, curated, and edited to show all the various important parts of us. How did we arrive at a point where masses of self-images are required to constitute a visual self-representation rather than a singular important image? To start, I want to observe how pictorial form has transformed over the centuries using art history and visual analysis. And I want to note at the beginning that there are several non-Western and pre-Renaissance forms of self-representation, and many of them resist observational practice, likeness-based practice, but I'm not addressing them in this paper, and that's because I'm very interested in how Western image making, specifically perspective, continues to dominate the way that we understand the world visually, especially through screen-based technologies. The earliest self-portraits in the Western sense, meaning a deliberate portrayal of the self as the self, emerge in the European Renaissance. Erwin Panofsky suggests that this moment reflects a broader shift toward understanding vision as grounded in the body, an act of direct observation rooted in physically situated viewer engaging the world. From the myth of Narcissus, who observes himself in a reflective pool, to Vincent van Gogh's self-portraits and contemporary selfies, the Western tradition of image making repeatedly returns to the representation of the self structured through observation. These images do not just depict the self, they shape how individuals understand themselves as social subjects, with observation established early on as embodied, spatial, and physically present process. Self-portraits, as we understand them, originate from the turning of observational technologies on the artist by the artist. These kinds of technologies range from simple like mirror devices to camera lucidas and camera obscuras. Early self-portrait artists' desire to observe accurately led them to develop technologies and materials as well. So things like paint, gesso, plaster, paper, drawing tools, optical and projective devices. So all of these technologies are shaping how self-representations are structured pictorial, in the pictorial sense. Observational drawing tools or drawing tends away from fantastical landscapes and towards more familiar lived space. Paint and drawing stylists rely on hand-eye coordination and reveal the dexterity or clumsiness of the artist and so on. So from the beginning, self-images are constructed through systems and technology, not just expression. We can see the transformation of the self-image as technology shifts. A silver point drawing by Leonardo da Vinci from the early Renaissance. Then next, I've given the example of an oil painting by Gustave Courbet in the mid-20th century. This is right before the invention of fixed photography. And finally, a daguerreotype by the daguerreotypist named Robert Cornelius. This is often considered to be the first selfie, a selfie made using a daguerreotype. We see a shift in materials from drawing and painting to photography. As Roland Barthes argues, the photograph is not constructed in the same way as a painting, but in a physical material trace that captures a specific moment in space and time through the camera's apparatus. And this further emphasizes the embodied space of vision. But though materials and observational intent influence the appearance of self-images, they're not the primary determinant of the form of early self-images. Across each of the images that I've shared so far, linear perspective, which is a set of rules rather than a physical or philosophical constraint, is the primary system structuring pictorial space. Linear perspective gave symbolic grounding to the perceptual experience of observation and dictated the use of drawing stylists, paint, and photographic processes to order images. Crucially, the perspective system dictates both Western painting after the Renaissance and is the foundational logic behind the photographic process. Linear perspective offers a single viewpoint, centers the viewing subject, and creates the illusion of a stable position in space. For centuries, self-images are grounded in a single moment and a single point of view. Albert Dürer, for example, an early innovator of perspective, used the system extensively in portraiture, helping to popularize it as the primary form of depicting individuals. He made self-portraits using the system that became the standard for self-imaging. Dürer's illustration on the right shows an observational drawing device he used in his studio to mimic his vision in the drawing process, which is a hallmark of the perspective system. Artist self-portraits that use linear perspective give us a spatial context where we feel present. We encounter the subject as a whole person in a single moment, at a single location. We feel immersed in the view as though it is ours. Perspective places us not just in the scene, but at its center. Perspective depends on the picture plane and a structured relationship between the viewer, image, and space. Raphael's School of Athens is a classic example of linear perspective, illustrating its function, origins in Greek geometry and philosophy, and containing a hidden Easter egg, a self-portrait of Raphael. As in our vision, diagonal lines called orthogonals appear to converge at a point or points in what we typically consider the background of the picture plane. Objects in the foreground appear larger. The viewer can sense the distance from herself to the objects in the image because, by using the rules of linear perspective, the image imitates our experience of embodied space. Linear perspective stabilizes the subject and reinforces embodied vision. Most important, it makes the viewer, the self, the center of every image that relies on it. Here, Raphael appears to the viewer in physically immersive, believable space, along with historical figures and grand ideas of his time. And here's just a closer view of Raphael's portrait where he feels very physically present, has personality. From artist self-portrait to selfie, images shape how individuals understand themselves within larger social systems like politics, media, and technology. By centering the viewer in important political, social, and spiritual and scientific events, perspective reflects a paradigm shift in self-construction across Western culture at the time. Viewers were no longer distant onlookers, but by the power of proximity, that much closer to direct participation. But something begins to change. As we move forward in time, a shift in pictorial structure becomes apparent alongside the shift in medium from painting and drawing to photography. Single images grounded in a single moment give way to multiple images within a larger picture plane. By the late 1800s, non-artists began using collections of images to construct identity. These images document life and include self-images. They circulate among closed communities and are not yet monetized at scale. They are still perspectival, but they're grouped. The structure becomes catalog-based rather than immersive. As Roland Barthes suggests, each photograph functions as material trace of what has been. In aggregation, these traces begin to organize identity across time rather than with a single constructed image. The structure of the picture plane has changed from immersive single viewer vision to cataloging and documentation. We're going from embodiment in the perspective system to organization in the catalog system of the Park to Visit album or the family photo album. At this point, information begins to overtake vision. We begin to datafy ourselves as a function of the accessible photographic process. The viewer becomes organizer and analyst rather than participant. Here are some more family photo albums that illustrate this process across the 20th century. Probably all familiar. Okay, as image accumulation evolves, companies like Meta, Google, and Apple use these collections to extract data. As Shoshana Zuboff argues, this marks a shift towards surveillance capitalism, where personal images are not just shared, but transformed into behavioral data through processes like image classification. Oh, sorry. But the impulse to datafy the self precedes big tech. It begins with the availability of photographic images. Platforms capture and reinforce this behavior, but they do not initiate it. They encourage the constant creation and sharing of new self-images, each of which provides additional sellable data and training material for algorithms, and now AI technologies. As Byung-Chul Han argues in The Swarm, the subject becomes dispersed into a field of digital traces, no longer a coherent self, but a stream of data points. We take on the gaze of platforms and corporations, seeing ourselves as data, but not as the data we define, as was the case with photo albums, rather as data selected to optimize the platforms. Images are now optimized not for interpersonal relationships, but for platforms. Unlike photo albums, we no longer control organization of these images, though we may feel like we do. Images shared through social media and stored within digital photo libraries are sorted, ranked, and interpreted through systems beyond us, and our behaviors around them are dictated by platforms as well. I'm sure we're all familiar with these kinds of pushes. Let's backtrack for a minute to recall and analyze the shift in pictorial form that has taken place since the first observational self-images were made in the 1400s in the West. From Dürer and Da Vinci to 19th and 20th century photo albums, pictorial space, which is what lies within the picture plane, has traded spatial immersion for visual organization and information. The space of the picture plane now appears as a container for multiple images, still individually perspectival, but arranged to demonstrate mastery of information and meaning rather than personal proximity. The space represented here is not the real embodied space of perspective, but the virtual space of the internet, the imagined content of servers made visible. The grid is the primary visual structure of this new pictorial space. Platforms present images as grids, which users curate according to their personal taste and self-concept. According to Rosalind Krauss, grids suppress traditional notions of authorship by eliminating spatial immersion offered by perspective. Beginning with modernism, the grid is associated with artists like Agnes Martin, whose work is on the left here, who use grids via various systems that eliminate expression and authorial decision-making. In this way, the grid structure reinforces the fragmentation of the modern self and reliance on outside systems and limitations to dictate form. Pictorial form is dictated by systems that prioritize data over embodied or perceptual experience. Self-construction is dictated accordingly. The grid structures offer a scaffolding for our visual organization of self may seem flexible. I get to decide what images appear where on my Instagram grid, with the limitation of the archival stacking function. For example, Facebook and Snapchat also use a grid structure to organize their static image content, but our control is extremely limited to the visual structures of our profiles, most of which are not widely seen anyway. Meanwhile, the true structure of data, as it is mined and sold by information infrastructure companies like Google, Meta, and Apple, remains totally invisible, almost totally. So the grid does distance the individual from their own self-construction, as Krauss argued, but it's purely visual, other than a few obvious visual constraints, like the chronological stacking function. So the grid is not the true structure of data in these platforms. Under the surface, these images are not organized according to our placement as we curate our profiles, nor does the grid supply their structural scaffolding. In fact, they're not organized according to visual logic really at all, but are instead organized by data, which is then optimized for the platform. If we were to visualize the functional structure of this data, namely how it is categorized and sold by information infrastructure companies, we would have to use an array structure rather than a grid structure, which is how it's organized in things that are hard for me to understand. In this presentation, I use grid and array as theoretical terms to distinguish between two logics of image organization and contemporary visual culture. While these terms have precise meanings in mathematics and computer science, I deploy them heuristically to describe how images are structured, authored, and circulated across artistic and platform-based contexts. A grid organizes space, and an array organizes relations. That's how I'm understanding those terms. Specifically, arrays are organized to optimize for platforms and corporations in a process that is invisible when compared to our consciously composed and curated grids. The grid is authored, conscious, and visual. It stabilizes meaning through visible order and control. The grid describes a consciously composed and spatially unified structure with deep roots in Western art, from the perspectival scaffolding of Brunelleschi and Alberti to modernist reinvention in the work of Agnes Martin. Linear perspective itself depends on an implicit grid that organizes space into a coherent, measurable system centered on the observer, a structure later theorized by Erwin Panofsky and Rosalind Krauss as the foundation to Western image making. Within this lineage, the grid stabilizes meaning through visible order and authorial control, presenting a closed and self-legible system in contrast to the distributed, opaque, and externally optimized logic of the array. For us, the grid logic of the platform UX provides the sense of authorship that naturally emerges from the perspective system. Arrays are organized less by author's conscious composition than by platform-driven processes of sorting, ranking, and circulation. Meaning emerges across the sequence, but that sequence is continuously shaped and reordered through largely invisible systems of optimization that prioritize engagement, visibility, and data extraction. In contrast to the consciously composed and self-logical grid, the array operates as a distributed and opaque form, aligning with the production and organization of images with corporate and algorithmic logics rather than individual intention. For us, the array structure, even of our own self-images, remains mostly invisible. It is derived in part from our choices as we curate our profile grids, but also relies on information we supply unintentionally, such as images we almost post but decide to keep private. So the grid is something that we make, and the array is something that we're inserted into. The array appears as a personal expression in the form of a grid, but functions through optimization and data extraction. Contemporary identity is constructed through participation in platform-structured arrays, which present visually as familiar, innocuous photo album-like grids. These grids are a facade that conceals complex image processing and categorization for data extraction. While we still organize, curate, and compose our profile grids using the authorial logic of photo albums, information infrastructure companies use complex algorithmic and computational processes to organize our self-images using the logic of capital. Our self-presentations are optimized not for interpersonal life, but for the extraction of valuable data. Our self-images have evolved visually to reflect this shift. If perspective centered the subject in social, political, and cultural events, widely available photographic processes multiplied the subject in such scenes. The grid reflects an attempt by artists to understand and thereby control a non-essential sense of self, and by non-artists just to get the sheer amount of images they were now responsible to manage under visual control. The platform array marks a shift where the structure of the image is self and self alone. Virtual space consists primarily of photographic digital images made using perspective system, always taken from a single person's point of view, reflecting their vision and experience. Every image shared can be thought of as a moment on the 4D timeline of a person's life. Each image cluster represents an aspect of that person that can be understood and optimized for profit by information infrastructure companies. Is it possible to use the array structure, but use it for purposes other than platform optimization? If we saw ourselves as data before platforms did, as a function of the photographic process becoming widely available, then perhaps we have more control over the structure than it currently appears. Artists are the people with the most ability to figure this out. They can reveal these systems, make invisible structures visible, reintroduce embodiment, and a lot of other things. Carmen Wynant mimics the contemporary pictorial condition of mass photography, an expanding grid-like accumulation of perspectival images, shifting attention from composing a single image to observing how images aggregate. Though far-reaching conceptually, this work is still mostly visually organized rather than relationally organized as in an array. Trevor Paglen uses systems and even mimics their processes as in ImageNet Roulette from 2019, but his work tends away from the image itself and lays bare the underlying structure. Rather than using these systems to generate a new pictorial form, he exposes how they operate, making the structure visible as the primary content of the work. The art objects and images themselves often feel like afterthoughts to the concept. I think it's possible for artists to generate a new 2D form that gives a more comprehensive view of the self and the world by understanding the perspectival self-image and its history, leading up to machine learning and vision. Perspective is itself a system, like data extraction, image classification, and machine vision. It's modeled and embodied from physical experience. We haven't lost the ability to see around these structures and develop new pictorial forms and image systems. It's the artist's job to do just that. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Thank you. Really, I think it was so great paper, especially when I think about that, how you're focused on the concept of space for your own concept of art. And I'm really curious about how you conceptualize the agent for your art practice. But probably we can think more about these terms during our panel discussion part. I would like to open the discussion part right now. Is there any question and comment? We will be happy to hear. Thank you. Yes, please. Yes, please.
I have a question for Jasmine. And I was wondering, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the difference between the array and the visual and the grid and so forth. But what of course stands out to me and becomes really interesting is how the array is about relations and relationships. And you had said in your conclusion that artists are the ones that can get in and really try to figure out what is going on with this. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what that might imply for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think artists are uniquely positioned to do this because we have an understanding of pictorial form, which I think is what is the driving force in all of these screen-based technologies. Like I just see a direct connection between perspectival images and, you know, what we're all looking at right now. So we have that knowledge, whether we're employing it or trying to react against it. We understand or can understand how it works. And that's kind of what I'm doing with this research and my own work, as my own visual work as well, trying to just understand that history. Then I think artists also have a contemporary and modern art history that your work is, from what I got from your presentation, is deeply, you know, tied to, which involves like understanding art outside of just the pictorial form and as, you know, a set of interactions that can take place between, you know, objects and communities and things that are not just art materials. So I think because artists are able to conceptualize a creative process, whether it's creation through relations that ends up as an image, painting on the wall or drawing on the wall, or if it's a set of relations that ends up generating some sort of other content, maybe, you know, if you think about something like social practice work or I forgot the name of the other art form that I wanted to reference, relational aesthetics. There it is. The art object is it's a different outcome, but they're all functioning on the basis of relation. So I feel like the array is very interesting because it's not visual. It's not primarily visual, it's spatial, and its function and computation, which is not my area. So I'm, like I said, using the term heuristically, but it's relation based, as are all art practices, if we want to conceive of them that way, and that sort of horizontal manner. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that.
So interesting. I'm just thinking at the same time, and probably I will be thinking very loudly right now. But it's very interesting to see these degrees of observation within different senses. When you're talking about how actually order of observation has changed, I remember that Niklas Luhmann, he was mentioning that second order observation is a kind of new area of observation, because it means that observation of observers or observation of observation in the book of the Gesellschaft, and Society of Society. I think it's interesting to see how these layers are opening in digitized world. Now, I think we are not talking about the way how we understand the concept of observation in Renaissance or in Victorian period, but multi layers of observations are on the stage. We have seen through your self-image and representative aspects and practice of art during your presentation. So how would you conceptualize the concept of observation nowadays in the optimization process? That would be my question. Maybe it can be also relevant to Jen's aspect and emphasize on visibility. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the kind of simplest way, I think understanding what observation is now is one of the main questions that I'm interested in as an artist. And I think it's hard to do that, but in the simplest sense, I think that we just see ourselves the way that the platforms have trained us to see ourselves. So we've just taken on the vision of a system or platform, and it's not embodied. And that's not necessarily, like, I'm not saying that's bad, but it's what's happened. So there's embodied space, you know, that we learned from perspective. And now there's this, you know, kind of space that we're existing in that's not quite physical.
That's interesting.
Can I tag on to that?
Go on.
Because I think about observation and depiction, and then perception and participation. And so I'm like, as you're describing it, I'm thinking about that idea of observation, but how it shifts, how I guess observations or really our perceptions shift when we're participating. So it's kind of that the shift that's kind of going on in my studio is trying to like observe, but just through some very different senses, even through repetition and repeating to the space, even through so like in the worm bin, for example, I'm observing, when I take the lid off to feed the worms, I look, and first I can smell. Does it smell right? Does it smell like they're happy? Are they moving? Can I hear it? Can I, so there's a lot of other kinds of like sensing that goes into sort of what might be considered an observation, and then the forms that result. So I'm kind of interested in that potential, or just I guess wondering, is there room for that shift, to be thinking about an expanded idea of what it means to observe or participate, or maybe they have to be different. I'm not sure.
I think, June, your question is challenging. I'm not a practitioner. Probably I would give a better answer if I were the practitioner or not. But the question is about the question of agents. Again, I don't know. Probably Jasmine would say something different. It's a performative question for me to create a new spaces. I think observer can be a kind of active agent during any art practices. So it's also opens the layers, the way how we define the concept of agents. I think in your case, the worms can be an agents, even though they are animals. That those agents can be an active and passive agents at the same time. But in art practice, the things and layers and degrees of those agents are changing, and I can't really estimate how those spaces can create a place for agents. I don't know, maybe Jasmine would give a better answer.
I mean, I think what is disturbing to me, but also interesting and maybe a source of some sort of, I don't know, hope, is that in the world of like 2D images, we've lost a lot of agency. Like the viewer has lost agency and artists have lost agency. And I started noticing that part of that is that we don't understand how images are made. So we're kind of dominated by image forms that are based on perspective, but we, even as artists and people have studied art for a long time, many of us don't understand like the underlying structure of those kinds of images. So it's clear that 2D images and 2D, whether they're moving or still, are extraordinarily powerful as they're deployed by systems and platforms. And I feel like that my whole thinking right now is that has to be taken into consideration. Like those are really, really powerful. And I'm attracted to the idea in like my own work of physically intervening on them, and inviting participants in work to physically intervene on them, as part of performances, or spectacles, where I do this work where I like paint in a public space and make a spectacle out of it. And it's all about observation and the moment of like strategic locations. But I don't know, I feel like there also has to be some kind of deployment of images like within the screen system for power to be had by artists and viewers. That's been my line of thinking, that it has to be kind of multi-level than kind of strategic, using image forms and like physical disruptive kind of techniques.
I got a question in chat. Perhaps I could also say something in response. So the question now, it's from Nur, is I think really about how much Foucault might be pessimistic about surveillance and visibility. So I don't see him as a pessimist about this. I think a lot of people have seen discipline and power as indicating something very pessimistic, that in a regime of surveillance we've become completely visible and completely under control in the model of the panopticon. I think, nevertheless, in discipline and punish, well, Foucault, I suppose, does indicate failures of power as well. So the attempt to reform the prisoner, I mean, of course, reform we might see as something good. But I think from Foucault's point of view, projects of the prison as reform are at least ambiguous because they belong to a realm of compelled speech, which at best is always ambiguous. I mean, compelled speech comes up in psychiatry. I don't think Foucault rejects psychiatry, but he is skeptical about power. I think the skepticism takes a form in which we shouldn't see power as either easily overturned or as all powerful. And we shouldn't see, the various ways in which power is necessary, but should be contested. The two things go together. So some of the issues which are very contemporary to do with visibility through, use of smartphones and so on, social media, these are issues which are not obviously quite the same in Foucault's time. He died before that. I think from Foucault's point of view, there's always, power will always undermine itself in some degree. There will always be cracks. It has to repeat itself. The mirroring process, which is mentioned in the question, well, the mirror itself always distorts and inverts and creates a kind of non-place, a kind of heterotopia. Well, power is always going to be affected by that. It's always going to try and represent itself, repeat itself in ways which will make it fallible. I think from Foucault's point of view, the earlier phases of punishment, the public kinds of punishment, always allowed for some kind of resistance. I don't think he denies that for the prison model or the surveillance model. The effort to get inside the prisoner's mind and have a reform, which is a kind of control, is something that's always resisted in practice. It's always fallible. Of course, Foucault himself was active in a prisoner rights movement, I think particularly, partly because his partner was very involved in it. So I think for Foucault, there's always room for activism. There's always room for very individually oriented and horizontally oriented actions, which will question power. And power is always fallible. So I don't think of Foucault as a pessimist. Obviously, I see him as a realist in showing how power might be infiltrating our space in ways we hadn't previously considered. But then that's a way of showing how we can resist it. Of course, there's late work on Foucault on ethics, which I think is about how individuality is something that persists, and that allows for horizontal forms of organization. I guess Foucault's somewhat suspicious of very homogenizing top-down forms of organization. There's always rooms for very individual, bottom-up, voluntary, horizontally organized, and imaginative forms. Whatever's going on in social media, whatever negative aspects, we can always do transformatory things. We can always think of ways of resisting the algorithm, resisting consensus, doing something different. Of course, social media is the kind of thing which always try and pick up on resistance. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be persistent. We don't have to be passive in the face of a kind of more homogenizing effects of social media. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, there, Professor. This is a very compelling and hopeful reading of Foucault, and the idea of the power is
I think, inherently fallible and provides the seeds for its own subversion is a powerful reminder, especially when we discuss contemporary digital panopticons. I truly appreciate the nuances regarding horizontal movements within these spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to read Dr. Tanya's question for Dr. Jane Schmitz, if you mind. How do threshold ecologies emerge at the margins of optimization algorithms, such as in supply chain failures during climate disruptions, and what non-human agencies, whether patterns, disrupt their efficiency logics? Thank you for the question, Tanya.
Yeah, I might need to hear it one more time.
Maybe you can also ask, probably that could be better formulation, if you mind.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I can read again. How do threshold ecologies emerge at the margins of optimization algorithms, such as in the supply chain failures during climate disruptions, and what non-human agency, whether patterns, disrupt their efficiency logics?
Okay, it's a really complex question. I think a lot of it might be going over my head. And I don't consider that a bad thing, especially when I work with worms. So I'm going to address it from a very on the ground and potentially underground way, because I think that, I mean, the kind of ideas that I'm exploring and experimenting with are about like grounding. They're the ways in which experience and embodied knowledge and like real physical interactions can pose that disruption in the times that are needed. So in other words, when you're talking about these disruptions at the edges that are potentially like, you know, failures in maybe more digitally organized systems, like where you're talking about climate change and supply chain interruptions and all of these things. And I think that in those moments of breakdown, the things that we really have are the relationships that we have built. So it's kind of it's both like a resiliency plan, but also a subversion plan. And what I am struck by, and it could be a part of just, you know, aging and getting closer to the ground, is how these moves are quite basic, but at the same time they build an infrastructure for disruption. But disruption in a growth way, disruption, like systemic disruption. So, Dr. Stocker, when you're talking about Foucault and these possibilities for this horizontal challenge to power, you know, it's building the infrastructure that puts that in place. And I mean, it is a little bit about infrastructure, but it's also the mindset. It's preparing the mind and the ground for those relationships to take place. So I'm not sure if I got anywhere near it, or if you'd like to propose another aspect of it, I'd be happy to give it another swipe. Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Tanya, thanks you, Jane Schmidt. Yeah, this is really interesting. Again, I think the way how you define the worms are really unique agents. First of all, what I have grasped as an idea is behind this idea. Then after grasping those agents as fundamental agents for creating spaces, carries us another point of view. And this point of view is about how the nature interacts with the human beings, and how actually nature is actually at the same time dialectically interacts with the human beings. They're kind of a thematical relation here, which I can describe as a counter relation for an human and a nature interaction. So that makes it very interesting, I think, and the sense of art practice. Thank you so much. Is there any other question or comments that you would like to add?
Is there time?
There is still time. We have 2 minutes left.
That's okay. If there's 2 minutes, that's okay. I just want to thank to everybody. Thank you, their professors.
Yes, I would like to thank all of the speakers who have enormously contributed for us to understand the nature of art practices with different senses between philosophy and art and communication. And I was so honored to moderate this great panel. Thanks to all listeners and contributors, Tanya, Associate Professor Nuremine Koç, and other participants. Thank you, Professor Barry Stoker, Jasmine Plotz, and Jen Schmitz. I hope we can see each other again. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Tuba. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Tugba, are you there? I wanted to apologize for being late. You know what happened? We had a time change from the time. So we had a time change, but my calendar didn't change. So I was going to come at 8.
I can understand you because on Monday I had the same situation. I had another meeting with philosophy for, philosophical orientation, Jasmine, and I had the same experience because I have just couldn't imagine that was about time situation. I can perfectly understand, so no worries. No worries
Oh
about
my gosh. Did I miss? So I came in with Dr.
Stoker.
Stocker's presentation. Was there one before his?
No,
He was
there was
first. It was the 3 of us. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe we can make another Zoom session, and if we can have time, because we couldn't do it actually, that would be great if we could have time.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tugba. It was a wonderful panel. Nice to meet you, Jasmine. Really interesting presentation. So
It was good to see you guys. I'm going to take off, but nice to meet you, Jean.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.